Good morning, everyone. My name is Mafipe Mchunga. I'm wearing two hats today, representing the American Chamber of Commerce and KPMG as well. On Monday, we ushered in a new government. It comes in with new policies, new ambitions, and I'm here today with a group of people who are interpreting what it means for them, what the new policy direction is, the opportunities that it creates. And I have an illustrious panel beside me here. I'll start with an independent accountant on my left, Mr. Beyani Zulu, followed by Ms. Florence Muleya from the Zambia Association of Manufacturers, Dr. Chabala, who's the chairman of Zambia Railways Limited, and also Mr. Munkanta Mulenga, private legal practitioner. Thank you very much and welcome to all of you.
Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Zulu, let me start with you. We often hear of independent economists. So today I'd like to hear from an independent accountant. And let's start with the issue of Zambia's international perception, the default on the Eurobonds, what can I say, budget deficits, the buildup of debts, both local and international, have tarnished Zambia's reputation on the financial side and probably limited borrowing as well. How do we come back from that? How do we restore international confidence in Zambia and the Zambian government?
Thank you very much for that question. I think before I even get into the detail, obviously I would like to congratulate firstly the UPND government for winning the elections. I think it's not just a win for the UPND and His Excellency Hakainde Hichilema, but it's a win for all Zambians. So congratulations to all Zambians for a smooth election process and also a smooth transition of power. It is something that we shouldn't take lightly. We should be very, very proud as Zambians that our democratic dispensation is maturing. To get back to your question, so when you look at economic confidence or international confidence in the country, there's a lot of factors that come into play. But before we get to really what we should do or what should happen for us to regain that confidence, let's look at briefly where we're coming from. Obviously, you've alluded to the fact that Zambia did default on its Eurobond repayments. That obviously had a dent on our country rating. We are currently rated as a default or country in default. We haven't really resolved that yet. So until we resolve it, we will continue to be in default. What do we need to do to restore confidence? Firstly, and fundamentally, I think just that dawn of change, if you've noticed, has brought a certain level of confidence to the global markets and investors, as it were. Just from the inaugural speech itself, just from the pronouncements that the president made as he was being sworn in, have brought a certain level of confidence. What does that mean? What it means then is the investment community, as well as players out there, expecting policy consistency to provide that level of confidence. What policy direction is this government going to give? If you listen to the president's speech, he was very clear. He believes the economic emancipation of this country is in the private sector. That pronouncement for him to invite the private sector to the table is in itself a sign of confidence that he is pro-business and his government are pro turning this economy around. Now, before we even get there, I think let's now deal with the elephant in the room. You spoke about the fiscal deficit. You also spoke about the excessive debt levels that the country is currently experiencing. That needs to be done if we have to restore the level of confidence that we need from our investors. How do we deal with it? Firstly, the reason why we defaulted was because we're trying to find a way of how we can restructure this debt so that it's less burdensome on our expenditure as a country. So that leg around how it should be restructured needs to be dealt with. That's where the IMF leg comes in. the way we'll handle the renegotiation and the debt restructure process, possibly with the coming in of the IMF to assist us with the restructuring of debt, will elicit a lot of confidence from the international community. So what you've seen already, remember, when it comes to key levers of confidence, there is economic fundamentals as well as those behavioral attributes from the government. So already the fact that we're getting those positive vibes is an indication that confidence levels will turn around. Why will those confidence levels also turn around to our benefit? Let's have a look briefly at what's happening in the global markets, for instance. Obviously, with the coming in of the COVID vaccine, there's a lot of turnaround. Economies are turning around, and they are getting back into the growth phase. Another added advantage that we have at Zambia is the increasing demand for copper. So copper prices are in an all-time high.
I'll kind of stop you there. I'll come back to you because you've raised an interesting point to the IMF. But let me just go around the table and then we'll discuss this point a second time. Absolutely. So over to Ms. Florence Muleya of the Zambia Association of Manufacturers. Now, manufacturers might be deemed similar to mining houses. They're never happy. They would always like some kind of change. Tell me about the change that you're looking forward to. We often hear of this term, a conducive environment. What does that really mean for manufacturers in Zambia today?
Thanks, Mafipe, and thanks to the American Chamber for this invitation. And looking at this question, most of the time, the first thing that comes to people's mind is that businesses will either be given something. But really, when you look at a conducive environment, we're talking about how well can business be done. Are you able to run smoothly in terms of how logistics are happening in the country? Are you able to ensure that as you go about undertaking your business, you are able to reach out to the lawyers in a way that allows you to undertake things in a good way? Are you able to get your permits, your licenses, and all these things? And so it's a whole basket of things, but the thing that I would like to speak to is, for example, permits. In our sector, manufacturing, we have a lot of permits, a lot of licenses that are inflicted on these companies. And for a sector like that, it means that the big companies can go ahead and thrive, but it discourages entrance by small members and small players. For instance, excise duty on manufacturing is like 9,000. That is both for a big guy and a small guy. To a big guy, 9,000 may be nothing, but to a small player, 9,000 is almost their working capital. So how do we get more manufacturers in if we have such prohibitive costs on them? We look at costs such as the Zambia Compulsory Standards Agency. They are charging manufacturers as much as 7,000 per quarter. And so if you have to pay 7,000 per quarter, for 4 quarters in a year, you're parting with almost 30,000 aside the 9,000 that you had paid in the annum. So already that means if you've got 50,000 to do a business, it all goes into regulatory fees. So whilst it may be seen that we want change, it is the environment that is not enabling us to be able to manufacture. And so permits and licenses for manufacturing become a very key thing going forward. If we want to see more small players, as was pronounced, then the aspect of permits really has to be dealt with.
You've raised a very interesting point because the tax system is the same way. It was designed for either corporates or very small entities, and there's nothing in between. But we have an aspiration to build up small organizations into corporates. So I think a realignment is needed there.
Definitely.
So it's almost as though the regulators started off in mind with a corporate, and they never scaled down the requirements and the needs from a regulatory perspective.
Indeed.
So there's work to be done there, basically. I'll come back to you with another question. Let me move over to Dr. Chabala. Dr. Chabala, you are the chairman of Zambia Railways Limited. For 2 decades, we've been told that rail is the future of transport. It will safeguard our roads. It will provide efficient logistics, cross-border travel, and very little has happened. Why is that, and what needs to change for us to realize that potential?
Thank you, Mafipe. When you say little has happened, I'll come back and raise a question on that. But to Mr. Zulu's point, I think we do need to recognize that there's a new party going to run the government of the country, effective Tuesday. Today, there's a note somewhere that today the Minister of Finance will be announced. We all anxiously wait for that to come through. But we should also take this opportunity, I think, to say congratulations to Bali, because Bali will fix it. And the things we're talking to here, I hope get to Bali somehow. And they form part of his toolkit for fixing things going forward. And actually, let me just pause and make this observation here that, yes, of course, it's His Excellency, and that's his official title, but I think we shouldn't lose sight of this moniker that is carried through campaigns. It's this Bali moniker. It's important because it will still leave him accessible. He says he's accessible to receive ideas. So if we maintain the Bali moniker, it shows that he remains accessible and people can go up and say, hey, Bali, this hasn't been fixed, and have we fixed this, etc., etc. So it's not being disrespectful. In terms of Zambia railways, yes, we need to use rail increasingly for transporting materials to run the economy, so to speak, because the way our economy is structured, and I find this very fascinating, that 50 years, almost 60 years after independence, we run the economy in a structure that Cecil Rhodes would have wanted to run it. And in fact, talk about Zambia Railways infrastructure, it's exactly the line that Cecil Rhodes built and left, bequeathed to the country after independence. So the structure of the economy is such that we bring in capital goods, intermediate goods for manufacturing, for mining, and we transport out raw materials in form of copper. And the economy has grown over time, but the infrastructure of rail hasn't grown that much. At the height of its performance, it was hauling about 5 million tons per year. We just, after a long time, hit the 1 million tons last year. But that's significant. That's significant, especially when you talk about, the impact on roads and the role that rails can play in terms of improving roads. If we say that we've moved 1 million tons of cargo, that's literally equivalent to more than 30,000, almost 35,000 truckloads moved off the road in a year. That's almost 100 trucks per day that we're moving off the road. Only 1 million tons. Now, can you imagine we do 2 million, 3 million tons? We'll be able to move a lot of trucks off the road. And another significant point is that even as the economy has grown multiple times since independence, the infrastructure, both in terms of road, rail, pretty much remained the same. Mm-hmm. So you're actually carrying more load on the same road, the same rail as the economy has grown. And we do clearly need to think about how we invest more in this infrastructure so that we can then open up the economy to grow. I can imagine that is also constraining. The fact that this infrastructure is a step must also be constraining the performance of the economy. So we need to open that up. With Zambia Railways, what we do need to do is to actually make the track much more reliable, much more solid. I talk about us being on the journey to solid infrastructure and reliable rolling stock. And for us to achieve that, we need to pay attention to minute small things like boats. The boats that boat, two rail tracks together, go inspect the length and breadth of that track, you're going to find we don't have all joints bolted. Those are derailments waiting to happen. It wasn't always easy to attend to these things in the previous dispensation. I'm so grateful that Bali, in his inaugural speech, said that there will be no more political interference in parastatals. So we can actually make bold business decisions that will ensure that the rail functions as it ought to function, that things are attended to when they need to be attended to, that things that need to be fixed are fixed when they're supposed to be fixed. So that you don't go and, as a chairman of the board, you don't even need to go and inspect infrastructure. You take it when things come to the board that they are done as the board, has guided. But in this case, you go on the ground, you look at things, and you find there's a whole lot of gaps in terms of simple things like boards, sleepers, and stuff. And of course, they're going to say we don't have capital, we haven't been given money in a long time. We also need to move away from that.
Yeah.
We need to actually be able to think within the businesses, within the organizations, how can we be innovative in a way we attract capital, in a way we attract funding for real. One big lever we can use, and again, Bali touched on this in his speech, the green economy aspect. If we are moving 30,000, 35,000 trucks off the road in 1 year by hauling 1 million tons, that's a whole lot of carbon emissions we are getting out of the atmosphere. The carbon credits we can get by virtue of doing that can be leveraged for us to access funding, carbon funding, for some of the working capital and some of the capital we need to rehabilitate the infrastructure.
I'll come back to you on that. I mean, because there are two things that jump out at me. One is that we are virtually a green producer of electricity. So the fact that electric trains have never been seriously discussed is amazing. It's very strange. But also I'll come back to you and say that we've suffered from an incrementalism, very minute adjustments. We're very comfortable working on the same rail line repeatedly. Nobody has said we need to build a rail line from Mongo to Chipata and it needs to be done in 36 months. Nobody has done that. We've lacked that bold decision making, and perhaps it's because people have been on the defensive for a long time. And this doesn't just go to the last government. This has been going on for 40 years. The last bold moves were made by parastatals sometime in the 70s. And we've been stuck with that infrastructure and that platform since then. But I'll come back to you to raise that question. Let me move over to another key thing that's happened there. And we're going to be asking Mr. Munkanta Mulenga about the legal framework. Okay, and I think we've got a situation where Zambia's ratings on the ease of doing business, speaking to the manufacturers, speaking to the international perceptions, Zambia's rankings have been quite poor. They've been going down in a number of key areas. I'll highlight some of these points. One of them is trading across borders, where we are 155th out of 190 countries. Enforcing contracts, 130 out of 190. Registering property, we also score poorly. And I think all of these speak to the predictability of our regulatory bodies, something that the manufacturers have touched on as well, and also the enforceability of contracts. So if we look at the enforceability of a contract, when we make an agreement, will it hold? Whether that's with the government or within the private sector, will it hold? What needs to be done to improve in this area?
Thank you very much, Mafipe, for that question, but also let me start by congratulating the incoming government on the resounding victory that was given to them by the Zambian people, but also to congratulate the Zambian people for the way the whole process was handled. It's something which in Africa is a rare sight, and we must be proud of that. Coming to your question about the issue to do with enforceability of contracts, and really that is something that is on the mind of most investors, whether local or international, that are seeking to invest in our country. Usually the issues that are looked at are how easy it is, firstly, to get your contract enforced. Should it come to a situation where you must take the matter to court, how long will it take you to have that process concluded? What will it cost you? I think the manufacturers have spoken to the costs that go into investing in this country, and also just the entire court process. Over time, Zambia has experienced tremendous strides in seeking to address the issues to do with the timelines that are associated with court processes. For a long time, we've had issues to do with how long it takes for one to get their matter resolved in court. For a business, it is something that you want to be done within the shortest possible time. And I think in the last 2 to 3 years, we have seen huge steps being taken in that direction. Various legislations have been passed to address the issue of turnaround. And as we speak today, we know that you start your matter, for instance, in the commercial division of the High Court, which is where most businesses will start their cases in. You are given strict timelines to which you must adhere to as litigants. And the court itself, the parties that are participating in the litigation are all given strict timelines to which they must adhere. So if they don't do that, they're going to face sanctions. So that is one issue that is already receiving active attention. And I think we need to enhance it by ensuring that that is applicable from the subordinate court to the highest court in the land. Because it will give certainty and predictability to whoever is going to come in this country and has this contract which they want to enforce should anything go wrong, to know that within this period I will have this matter resolved. Another issue has been the cost involved. So it's a cost related to lawyers, cost related to the court process itself, costs related to the enforcement of your judgment. Now, Zambia being what it is, really by and large a consumer nation, you realize that most of the costs that are associated with the processes that involve enforcement of contracts are really consumer related. And so it becomes a question of how do you balance that aspect? Because I would imagine, speaking for lawyers maybe, that is also considered their livelihood. The standard of living in Zambia, as we all know, is something that is pretty steep. So, on one hand, you are looking at the people who are considering this as a business. On the other hand, you are looking at this being a service to those that are seeking your expertise. So, we are hopeful that with the pronouncements that were made in the inaugural speech, as well as in the acceptance speech, are going to go a long way in helping all of us reduce the related costs of doing business in Zambia. The court has tried as much as possible to keep those costs at the very minimum. But as we know, it's not everybody to whom 10 kwacha will be a small amount. So I think there's also been quite a good amount of effort being put in seeking to help those that may need pro bono services, for instance, in seeking to bring justice to whatever case they're bringing.
But isn't it a concern that we need so many matters to go to litigation in the first place? Because somebody should issue you with an invoice and you should pay it in response because you're contracted to do that. To get to the point.
And Makipe, remember that we are talking of a number of related issues here. Maybe the question we should be asking is, why is somebody not paying you?
Yes.
Could it be that they too are relying on the third party who are also not paying them for the service of the issue? So we need to look at the whole picture and see what is happening in the environment. We all know, for instance, that government tends to be the biggest client to almost every sector. I may not directly be dealing with government, but I may be dealing with you, whose business depends on government. So if government is not paying you, it means my services to you will go unpaid.
Yep.
So government plays a critical role when it comes to ensuring that the business environment is one which is functioning with as little disruption as possible. Courts should really be the last resort. I should not be entering into a contract and immediately thinking about going to court. You get the point? So we need to address that, but also addressing the issue to do with the alternative dispute resolution mechanism that we have in this country. I think Zambia still needs to do a bit of work in that area, particularly in the mediation process. Because I shouldn't be going to court as a first instance to resolve my dispute with you on any contract that I have. I must have the option also to have a mediation process started privately, which can help us resolve that at a minimal cost without having to incur extra costs that might help us going to court. So that's what I would say for now.
Thank you for that. I mean, you've touched on an interesting point that I'm going to take over to our independent accountant, Beyani Zulu. What's actually happening in the debt space? From where I'm sitting, the government owes a lot of different organizations, a lot of money locally. So the confidence in you will be paid on this date has been eroded over a long period of time. But as we said, it's got a chain reaction. There are different people who are not being paid as a result of that, and how to unwind that whole process is interesting. You mentioned the IMF earlier. The challenge that comes in with the IMF is that they demand discipline and conditions. They'll rein in a lot of spending that the incoming government may have already committed to make. So the two go against each other in some way. How will the government unwind this massive debt chain that is taking place? Go back to having credibility in the value of a government payment, while also entering into an IMF program that will constrain spending. How does that work?
So maybe we should also go back to the reasons why the government, for instance, was failing or is having challenges to pay those suppliers. Mm-hmm. The real challenge that the government is faced with is debt. Mm-hmm. The debt burden is huge, particularly the foreign debt element. Remember, when we look at the revenues that the government makes, mm-hmm. over 80% of those revenues are going towards servicing external debt. So effectively, the priority was servicing debt. And there was very little that was being channeled into the viable economic sectors for them to run normally and to have businesses boosted in those sectors. So what will happen now with the IMF coming in and obviously with the debt restructure taking place is that if the government is able to renegotiate these debt positions, it means the debt burden in repayments will be reduced. The government now will have a bit of headroom to channel those resources into other sectors of the economy. Obviously, critical to that channeling of those funds into these other sectors is dismantling the arrears locally. And that's where now dismantling arrears relating to local suppliers comes in. I'm sure if you heard the president, he did allude to the fact that his government will be supporting SMEs and they will support local businesses to ensure that they thrive. So with that background and the fact that now he's obviously set up an economic task force to really understand what needs to be done to make this economy rise again. Mm-hmm. P1, I'm very confident, will be around how those arrears, particularly to the local suppliers, will be dismantled. Mm-hmm. What that does is, once those funds are rechanneled into the economy, the expansion will now be driven by the private sector and not necessarily restricted to the government. The government now will also be given a bit of headroom. Remember, their repayments to external bondholders have reduced because they've renegotiated their contract. Then even sectors like the health sector, the education sector, even the social services will have funding. Mm-hmm. And that funding effectively trickles down to the small businesses and the individuals out there. And that's what drives the economy. So effectively, that's the angle that we obviously need to deal with.
Let me follow this on. I mean, the debt is often spoken about as being an insurmountable number, but I've got a different perspective. And if we're going to reposition ourselves as an African Singapore, we need to think big here. Let me ask a question, Dr. Chabala. $13 billion. And you've worked for international fund managers, global presidents, etc. Is that a lot of money?
Very important question, Mafipe. No, actually, I don't think it's that much money. Here's why. We lose $3 billion a year through illicit flows. just illicit flows, $3 billion a year. All we need to do is follow that money, go find it, rein it in. Already that 13 billion is reduced to 10 billion in 1 year, assuming the whole 3 billion goes towards that. But the other dimension, though, is that of that 13 billion, maybe 5 billion or so that went through the Euro bonds. Is it 3?
3 billion.
3 billion was transparently priced. Okay, we actually know the quantum of debt and how it was priced. The balance is opaque. And, we say that, the fire tenders were overpriced by about $30 million, the true value versus what was paid. Well, extend that some of these dates that have been contracted through the contracts that have been done, in the country. That phenomenon probably applies there as well. Okay, so if we actually seriously go and scrutinize this debt, seriously look at what value we got out of that and potential for inflated prices, we'll find that yes, there's a lot of inflation in there. Can we follow the money? Can we prove that these things were indeed inflated versus value we got for it? Chances are it's easy to prove that. If we follow the money, we can knock off some of those numbers in this debt. So where I sit, I'm actually thinking that if we curb illicit flows, if we go and review these debt levels, especially those that came through like infrastructure contracts, we find that the debt will shrink quite a bit. So yes, 13 to our GDP looks like a big number, but if we can actually restructure these things, follow illicit flows, it can very quickly shrink. And I believe that the IMF and the World Bank were employed, I think, in 2018 to assist with dealing with illicit flows. If when they come, they don't just focus on the internal debt, on social spending, and they always like reining those things in, but they should also look bigger and broader at illicit flows. Look at the structure and nature of contracts we have in some of this debt. If they assist with dealing with that, they'll find that they actually help this country, help the democracy premium that we've just yet again demonstrated to this continent and to the world, help that continue having traction by making sure that the economy also works and functions.
I totally agree with you. 9 months ago, I was in Lagos, and we went to see an oil refinery under construction in Lagos, which is valued at $13 billion and is owned by Aliko Dangote. One man. Yeah. So that's one piece of infrastructure. So what I took away from that was that as part of our economic growth strategy, we also need to focus on building up business people of that scale, because they are a lightning rod for investment. They attract investment. We've always looked at foreign direct investment as a government-to-government issue when it should actually be a private sector-led matter in which you have a group of people who are able to mobilize capital inbound. They can turn the economy, and we're lacking those people right now. Looking at other areas where we're weak, you often hear that importing goods into Zambia is expensive, so we're at a disadvantage. Okay? I always question that, because somehow we have cooking oil and other products that come all the way from Asia, but they somehow land here cheaply. You'd like to say something, though?
Just that's a very important point. When we talk about goods coming here, we say because we are landlocked, they get here expensive. But we have very low value things. This raw blister copper that goes from this country tens of thousands of kilometers to where it goes to be value added.
Yeah.
Why is it that companies are happy to transport low value things that much distance, and yet they say because you're landlocked, imports will be expensive? It's sort of actually not adding up. Yeah. Because if we are importing finished goods, the cost of transportation as a fraction is much smaller. Compared to raw material being exported, the cost of transportation will be a much bigger proportion of the value of that.
Yes.
So this whole economics needs to be, I have done some economics in my life, but it actually does need to be critiqued, and we do need to just start changing paradigms. Okay. And I speak of a very specific case of a few weeks ago, some people wanting to ship manganese out of Serenge. And they came to Zambia areas and, went through the whole rigmarole, and surprising how difficult it was to get this quote. I'm speaking about the company that I'm chairing. But anyway, eventually we get the numbers. And they're like, these numbers don't add up. Because if we add the cost of transportation to the value of manganese, the manganese will be of no value when it gets there. But I'm like, but exactly the point. Why are you transporting raw manganese? Why don't you add more value to the manganese here before you transport it?
Yep.
No, because the companies that want it where it's going want it in raw form. Why? Because they want to add value to this manganese in a destination country. By doing that, they are boosting activity in their economy. They're boosting jobs, they're boosting output, they're boosting their GDP.
Yes.
If all those things can be done here, can you imagine what this economy will look like? How this economy will turn around? And again, in the inaugural speech, we heard this in terms of the value addition, the value chain of mining, and how we can do more with that. We do need to do more with that. Now, we are in a catch-22 situation in the sense that we would love to have more value adding done here, but we don't own these mines. They are foreign-owned, FDI-driven. So we do need to come up with a formula with incentives where it's much more beneficial for these mines to have more of their copper left here, value added here, than stockpiling it on the seas for waiting for a price to go up, than sending it to other industrializing countries where adding value actually boosts the economies while we're left with the economy that's
the formula that we've applied for close to 60 years has been a failure because it has left us impoverished and laden with debt. Going on to the logistics issue, they say it's expensive to import goods, but they don't talk about that on the export side. But here's another interesting one. What can we do about it? We can make our borders efficient. Again, going back to the ease of doing business survey, it takes up to 4 days for a truck to cross our border inbound or outbound.
That's why they should use rail.
As manufacturers, does this have an impact? That cost ultimately has to land somewhere, and I believe it lands on the manufacturer's plate.
Definitely. And during COVID, the 4 days has increased to 7, if not 12, because what would happen is we heard the time in South Africa when borders were shut down, COVID, and then also the issue of violence. And so the importance of ensuring that border efficiency is top-notch is important, in the sense that aside from the costs of the cost insurance and freight, demurrage and storage then become an additional cost. And with the dollar then, of course now it has appreciated, but then when the dollar was in its 20s, in a day, and this does not only include the fact that you have to store goods, but the people on the trucks as well, if they have to man the goods and ensure that they're secure, there's security, there's payment of food, there's payment of accommodation, and so on and so forth. So the cost completely compounds. But I'd like to also just speak to the aspect of value addition and why we don't seem to be moving in a direction that can help us. This aspect that we spoke about in terms of the environment and how conducive it is, I spoke to permits, but when we speak of a whole lot of other things, we find that when investors are looking at an economy and deciding whether to go ahead and build a superstructure that allows them to be assured that there will be no issues going on in the future, they look at a whole lot of other things. And some of the things that we saw previously was that you have established a factory, you want to ensure that you move away from exporting maize in its raw form, and you want to have stock feed, or you want to ensure that you can send out maize products that have been value added. And what happens? There's an export ban. You have made your business decisions that have projected you in a position that you think, of course, I'm going to take advantage of an environment, and then boom, export ban. Zambia only has a small population, and the neighbors that we have are what are driving manufacturing in Zambia. So this business of export bans, I think, is something that the incoming government needs to relook and stop. Because if we want investment that allows value addition, there should be this consistency that allows you to know that no matter what, I am going to sell. So imagine you have truckloads and truckloads loaded your katundu on the rail, and at the time it reaches the border, no, take it back. And these are goods that will either go bad or will not be able to stay for a long period, and you have lost out. So this consistency in business is what is required to ensure that value addition in this country can move along.
Absolutely. Heading over on the legal and regulatory side, because that's important. If you're making a 20-year investment, you want stability. I heard a potential Minister of Finance saying yesterday that there's still time to consult on the incoming budget, and I'm going to write in. My recommendation will be, rather than a 1-year budget, can we have a 5-year budget with adjustments that you make year on year responding to what's taking place? Okay? Those are simple measures. They don't cost any money. We've not done them. What else could we do to address the legal and regulatory barriers that we've created ourselves that hold back our economy?
One of the things that any investor at any level talk about, let me use the example of individuals wanting to buy land and build their house or whatever it is. One of the things that you first consider is how are you going to be able to get your title, which will guarantee the security of your investment.
Yes.
So the legal and regulatory framework needs to be predictable and certain. The manufacturers have talked about the spontaneous export bans that we often see them subjected to. But it's not just in the manufacturing sector. I think there are a lot of sectors in the economy which experience that arbitrary shift in policy and in regulation. We need to get that right almost across all sectors of the economy if we are going to attract investment from outside, but even amongst ourselves. One of the things that Zambia, I think, has lacked for a long time is speaking to the issue of exporting raw material, is having a firm, predictable regulatory and legal framework around how investors are going to help the Zambian economy itself grow in the first place. I've given this example. We know many people, for instance, who have worked for years in South Africa. We all know that once you have a business in South Africa, you're not going to be allowed to take everything out and leave them with homes and everything else. Why? Because their legal and regulatory framework has certain situations which require you to give a certain percentage of your profits and investment in South Africa. Zambia doesn't have. Hence, we are seeing, as has been said, most of our economy being owned by foreigners is experiencing this massive shift from where the minerals are being mined, for instance, being taken to another country, but the economy there are boosted, and we are asking ourselves, what are we doing? So, in the main, we need to start focusing on having legal and regulatory frameworks that are going to stand the test of time, that are not dependent on individual governments that come in at any given time. We need to address that. How are we going to address that? We probably need to start looking at enshrining some of those things in the Constitution. Because what that will guarantee is that no government that comes in today will be able to easily turn around a policy that is meant for the good of the country. So we need to have a serious look at the economic aspect of our policies within the Constitution, and then translate that into the various sectors of the economy that we want to see boosted in this country.
You've actually raised an interesting point. My personal view is that part of the corruption that we've seen or experienced over the last 10, 15 years has been attributable to the fact that we have completely offshore entities that are operating here. They can do transactions and have nobody who is locally accountable for them. When that crime is unearthed, they just disappear overnight. And I mean, that's one way of dealing with it, is to have people who are anchored locally and must account for their decisions. I mean, are you in line with that? Do you agree with what I'm saying there?
Exactly. I mean, think about it. If the people that are investing in your country, like you're saying, are investing in a foreign country, and all the decisions that they're making are really in the interest of where they are staying and not the host country, when there's need for you to reach out to them, as we saw, for instance, in the recent past, where the issue of mines and the repossessions and everything was being discussed, we never had those people come back here. No. They were talking from wherever they were based. So we need to have a framework that would invariably force such investors to actually come into the country and sit at the table with us, because they would know that at the end of the day, there's a certain amount of their investment which they won't be able to take out if they don't play ball with the owners of the country.
And I think attached to that is also local ownership. If somebody has a local stake, they will fight and defend that organization to the very end. And I think we need to move to a situation where we offer perhaps its tax incentives or some kind of progressive measure to drive local ownership in all companies. Doc, over to you.
Sorry to come in here. The issue of how these entities are set up and how they operate is very cardinal in obviously how they behave. And I was thinking that one of the things we can do is, apart from some local ownership, apart from regulating how much money can go in and out, actually subject them to public scrutiny. Declare some of these entities in especially sectors prone with illicit flows, deem them public interest entities. Mm-hmm. And by deeming them public interest entities, they are then accountable to the public through a committee of parliament, for instance. In the same way that the Public Accounts Committee holds public officials before it to explain the goings-on in the entity they oversee, the same way these entities would be held before a public interest entities committee to account for financial flows, to curb these illicit flows, to account for this notion that an entity can operate for 10 years without declaring a profit, and somehow we believe that that is okay for the investor. Well, they've got to be involved in something, some malfeasance of sorts that allows them to continue operating for 10 years without declaring a profit. These are sort of things that should actually be unearthed through a public interest entity sort of a committee. Why not leave it to a regulatory body? Because a regulatory body can be captured very easily in a way that a public accounts committee or public interest entity committee can't be captured because it's part of the public, part of parliament.
Before I come to, we're still on the international side. Next, I'm going to actually ask about how we address the issue of domestic debt, because government aside, we've destroyed our own economy by having no consequence for what you'd call illegal transactions. People enter into transactions that they have no intention to honor, and there's no consequence for it. Checks, for example, were worthless in the 90s because people could issue a check, it bounces, and then they don't honor that commitment. When new regulations came in that made it illegal to issue an underfunded check, suddenly they had authority about them, and people took checks for the first time. We probably need to extend that discipline to borrowing in general. Any form of commitment, contractual commitment to pay debt, must be enforced. How how would that impact our interest rates? If we could bring down the default rate by bringing in new regulations, and I'll speak to the both of you about that. I mean, on your side, how low could our interest rate go? We're sitting at 24.5% now. If the issue of dishonesty was eliminated from that structure, and the credibility is brought back to the government structure, as we said, the discipline, what could we aspire to in terms of borrowing rates? Because that could be fuel for our economy.
So fundamentally, at the core of why people default is because they don't have money and they run out of options to raise money so that they can meet their obligations. And the key driver for that is interest rates. And like you've rightly pointed out, they're very high. We have to get back to why they are high. Remember, the government acts like that invisible hand that dictates the benchmarks at which the lending happens in this market. And currently, because the government has overborrowed, they have to keep going back to borrow for them to raise funds to run the affairs of the business. Remember, a lot of their income and a lot of their revenue was going towards external debt servicing. Mm-hmm. They had to find a source to raise money for other services, and they were borrowing locally. So because they were borrowing at high interest rates, they pushed out or crowded out that SME and corporate entities. Corporate entities were no longer able to borrow at those excessive rates. Mm-hmm. Because, I mean, if I've got the option of lending to you, Mafipe, or lending to the government of Zambia, I mean, it's a no-brainer. I'll lend to the government of Zambia. Because if there's nothing like the government will die, right? I won't be able to cover my debts. But on your case, I mean, sorry to say, but there is that element of some level of default that can happen by nature of who you are as an individual. So it's easier to lend to the government because it's got ability to even print money to pay. So even banks as well found it easy to make their money by lending to the government, lending to the ordinary citizen out there. So for us to bring down the interest rates, we need the government to stop borrowing the rate that they borrow.
Yes.
Minimizing that appetite. Of course, once they've lessened their debt burden, we will see a reduction in interest rates. The fact that they act as a benchmark lending rate, and a lot of the factors such as inflation spill off from all those lending rates will mean that slowly inflation will start tapering down because interest rates are going down, and that now gives the opportunity to corporate entities if all those projects, development projects that they've shown because borrowing was excessively high, those will not start coming back to the savings. So they can raise funds through going to funds, so they can raise funds off the capital market. So we will see a lot of activity, and that consequence of that activity would definitely result in the stimulation of other sectors, manufacturing, for instance. I mean, a lot of the aspects that Florence spoke about, the local manufacturers can't expand their businesses because they don't have a cheaper way of raising resources to add value to their produce. So with interest rates coming down, with government's huge appetite for debt coming down, we should see inflation coming down as well, and availability of opportunities for institutions, corporate entities, and individuals like yourself and I to raise money by borrowing from banks and use that money to channel it back into the economy to stimulate it back to growth.
Here's a quick question I have. When we reached the epic completion point, was it 2008 or 7, whatever it was, and Zambia's debt was all written off? As an accountant, I immediately realized this debt is coming back because we didn't investigate why we acquired it in the first place, the rules and regulations that allowed that, and there were no restrictions put in place. So even here where we are now, though it may be inconceivable, the debt may actually be on the way up if we don't make the right adjustments. Because left to our own devices, we've ended up in a debt trap. So who governs and how the regulatory framework of the government, all the systems that would need to be adjusted to prevent that?
Ideally, you are looking at an issue that must involve all the key players in the economy. Why do I say so? Because when you have regulations and the legal framework in place, there are certain institutions and players in that chain that are responsible for ensuring that what is in place is being observed. Oftentimes, like you have observed, we find ourselves in a situation where we've got good laws and regulations on paper, which nobody bothered to enforce. And so somebody will be able to do something that goes against what is actually in the law without any consequences at all. So talking about Parliament, for instance, the critical role that it plays in providing the checks on the executive is one sector, one key player in the economy that needs to be sharp and independent. If we are going to succeed as a country in ensuring that the debt issue is tackled once and for all, we need to revisit the supervision or the check that Parliament is supposed to have on the executive in acquiring debt. For a long time, that has been something that has been talked about with very little traction in terms of enforcing it. We need to examine where is the problem. Because everybody knows that today we might be in a position where the IMF will come, help us clean up our books. But as long as there isn't that independent regulator on the executive, for instance, to say you cannot go back and start accumulating debt, we may find ourselves back in this position a few years down.
I totally agree with you. And while you're holding the mic, we're beginning to wind down now. So I'll pose the question to each of you consecutively. What are your aspirations for the incoming government? What change are you hoping to see?
The biggest change I'm hoping the new government will implement is having institutions set in place that are independent from political interference to enable them do their jobs, play their roles in ensuring that the economy is not dependent on the person who's holding office at a given time, but is dependent on all the key players in the sectors of the economy doing their job without any ramifications. I think one of the things that we have experienced over the years in this country is that even those that have got the mandate to do certain roles and play certain roles in ensuring that everything is running smoothly tend to fear doing their job because they're always looking over their shoulders and thinking, tomorrow I might be removed if I do anything against the government. We need to have institutions that are independent and free to carry their mandate.
Thank you for that. Doc, over to you. Your aspirations.
Thank you, Mafipe. I actually do. I do feel with government, the new government, in terms of the burden they are inheriting. Okay. If you do, I'm not an accountant, but if you use accounting speak and you try to do income versus expenditure sort of weighting, pro forma going forward, you see that the promises that the incoming government has made and the expenditure that entails, it will blow any income that they'll make over the same period out of water. Okay, there's a lot more expenditure expectation than projections of income. So there's need to really sit down and systematically work through what the government can do in the immediate, medium, and long term to up the income side, to balance the expenditure. 5 years is very short. And for the promises that have been made, if the work doesn't start now, we're not likely to see much traction come the end of 5 years. And we don't want this to be the shortest lived government. You know, we went from Kaunda 27 years, MMD 20 years, PF 10 years. This government should be projecting to 20, 30 years. This party should be projected to stay in power 20 to 30 years, given the basis on which they're starting off. But to do that, they do need to be able to find resources to be able to meet the promises that they've made. The first thing, quick fix, cut the leakage, as we spoke earlier on. Some of these silly contracts that we got into, some of these foolish procurements that we did, rein those in. A second one, it's to like I mentioned earlier on, go and look into these illicit flows and find as much as we can from there to bring back home. The third thing is restructuring the entities that can contribute to generating income in the state-owned enterprise terrain. There's always this argument that government shouldn't be in the business of business. It's just put out an enabling environment and business should do what business should do. But if I tell you that one of the most profitable, consistently profitable airlines in the world has been government-owned, you'll probably find it hard to believe. Not only government-owned, but declaring profits and dividends to government on a regular basis, which that country has set up a very good fund, sovereign wealth fund, into which this airline pumps, its proceeds. So the state-owned enterprises, especially those that are in businesses that private sector is not involved in, can be used to generate income for government. Not only tax income, but also dividend income. Okay, so they shouldn't be seen as a burden on the fiscus. They should rather be used as a means of generating extra revenue for the government. Let them work as businesses. Again, thank you for the promise that there will be no political interference in these things. Let them therefore run as businesses. Let them generate income. And if the people that are involved in those businesses are not generating income, that's a measure that should be used to take them out.
Yes.
Not whether they are one color or the other.
No, thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you for that, Doc. Zam.
Yes, from our perspectives, number one, if I can just touch on to the issues of debt. Why have we been accruing debt? We don't have enough money. We haven't been raising enough revenues. And if I, as Florence, do not have enough money to undertake my expenditures as a family, the next thing is to go and borrow. So we need to start thinking the other side. We need to grow the revenues. And private sector is here to grow the revenues. But when you fix them, they run away. When you allow them to operate in a space where they're open enough and they're free enough, they will show you their books and they'll give you things as you expect them to be. So we need to think revenue growth. And revenue growth will be a big way of ensuring that the debt is reduced going forward. How can they do it aside from the tax fixing? It's also the investments. I'll give you one statistic which really, really shocked me. Manufacturing imports in 2019 were worth $36 billion. You were talking about $13 billion in debt, $36 billion imports in manufacturing, okay? So if the private sector is there, they need to be used. But these investments are being hidden because they are in a situation where they don't know what's going to happen next. They don't know how it's going to pan out. But if we allow them to thrive, we are not only going to create the revenues in form of tax, we are also going to bring in those much needed investments, the $13 billion kind of petroleum project you spoke of in Nigeria. If we move away from importing, this 36 million can then be put into having local investments locally. The issue of permits and licenses, I think I will not belabor that again, but also the aspect of local content policy. We have one currently where we have said at least 35% of whatever is happening, at least in manufacturing, should come from the local market. But if this can be extended, and I was quite happy with the angle that you brought in, instead of just looking at it as in terms of labor, in terms of local raw materials, it's also ownership. It can also be extended to the aspects that you spoke to. And if we can think strategically, we don't have to chase the foreign investors out. They can bring their investment, but allow for these joint ventures that ensure that the locals are also being carried forward. Because if the locals are left behind, we're going to have in South Africa?
Thank you, Mafipi. I think number one for me should be reducing the cost of living. Currently, it's extremely high. I think just picking up from where Florence left off, I mean, she also touched on the aspect of individuals failing to survive because the cost of living is extreme. That should be priority. And if you listen to the president, he delivers on his view that the focus for the next 5 years will be bringing that cost of living down. Definitely headed for some economic advancement. Number two, I think Mr. Mulenga touched on it as well. Policy consistency. Policies need to be predictable. You also alluded to the fact that maybe we should resort to 5-year budgeting period or budgeting cycles than the 12 months that's currently prevailing. What you were trying to position is around predictability of policies and predictability of pronouncements coming from the governments. We need those to be consistent, and also the messaging from all the government players, government arms should be consistent. Not today, this arm of the government is saying one thing, the next day the other arm of the government is saying another. We need policy consistency. And these policies should be prioritized in the following key sectors of the economy. Number one, mining. We need to see some policy direction in the mining space surrounding the taxing processes or taxing regulations in that space so that it's able to stimulate additional investment. Number two, the president touched on it as well, agriculture. Agriculture has got great potential for Zambia. I mean, one of Bali's critical promises is to deal with the aspect of the unemployed youth. Once agriculture is stimulated as a key driver of this economy, a lot of these unemployed youths will find themselves in that space. And that's where the youth can go and participate in bringing back the glories that this economy can give. The interesting bit with pushing those two key sectors, plus manufacturing, is that what will happen is effectively there will be more money now getting down into the economy, even to the ordinary guy. Bana Mulenga selling fritters at the corner there will be able to have a lot more people buying from her because a lot more people now have got access to money and they can spend. So the consumer expenditure will also go up, and that will effectively lead to a stimulation of the overall economy. So for me, I think it has to come down to consistency. The government just needs to be consistent in its messaging. And I like the fact that if you've heard the president speak, and if you hear some of his other colleagues in the party speak, their messaging is very consistent. If they can keep up with that and deliver on what they consistently keep telling us as promises, then definitely we should see some turnaround in this economy.
No, thanks for that. I think we're winding up now. The two key messages that I'm taking away from here are that, one, we need to work on the system of controls that manages government operations so that they happen on their own without any external input. And the second key point is that we need to infuse Zambians into the decision-making process within the private sector so there's accountability. Accountability and a means to manage corruption and stamp it out, to have people who will be there and say, what were you doing at this point? So we've heard from some luminaries here, and I'll just go through the names once again. Mr. Beyani Zulu, independent accountant, you rarely hear of those. We have Ms. Florence Muleya, who's from the Zambia Association of Manufacturers, Dr. Wala Chabala, chairman of the Zambia Railways Limited, and on the far side, Mr. Munkanta Mulenga, legal practitioner. Thank you very much. I'm Mafipe Mchunga on behalf of the Chamber, and also on my own behalf, I'd like to thank you all for tuning in today. Thank you so much.